The date is April 11th, 2001, and we're interviewing Dr. Vito Malta for the Avtex Oral Histories. Dr. Malta, can you tell us when you first came to Front Royal and how you first became involved with what was then American Viscose?
Yes, well, I first came to practice on February 14th, 1949, and then I began my practice of medicine. What, you want me to jump now to when I went to work for the plant?
What first brought you to Front Royal?
Well, I came to Front Royal because I was looking for a small town in Virginia that did not have a physician. But if they didn't have a physician, well, then you wouldn't want to be there. But anyway, I wanted to be a small town general practitioner. That's why I came to Front Royal.
Why? You're not from Virginia, are you?
No.
Where are you from?
Well, the way I came to Virginia was through the State Board of Medical Examiners. After I appeared before the State Board in December of 1948. That's one of the requirements of getting your license in Virginia. You must appear personally before the State Board. And they gave us a list of towns that were looking for physicians. So Newmarket was looking for a physician. So I stopped in Newmarket to get gas, and I asked the gasoline attendant, I said, have you all gotten a new physician yet? He said, yeah, he came. We got a doctor in last month, which was December. I figured, well, there goes Newmarket. So then he mentioned Mount Jackson. He said, if you would, he said, Mount Jackson is looking for a doctor. So they have a doctor, but they're not very happy with him. And he happened to be a German refugee, a physician from Germany, from Hitler's persecution. But anyway, so we drove through through Mount Jackson, but you could tell it was just a country town on the highway. And so we started back to go down to Roanoke, and then my wife was looking at the map and said, looks like it's a pretty good sized town about 60 miles away, Winchester. She said, why don't we go up there? So we turned around and went up to Winchester, and we spent the night in Winchester, and then the next morning I called a physician in Winchester, and he mentioned Front Royal. Previously, a doctor in Harrisonburg had told me about Front Royal. He said he got patients from Front Royal. He said that'd be a good place to start. And so we came to Front Royal, and I spoke to the Western Union operator on Main Street that was in where the chamber office is there now, in the old train station, Miss Clayton. And she said, so I asked to look for the directory. I looked down the list of physicians. So she gave me the rundown on every physician in Front Royal. She said we could use 2 or 3 more general practitioners. So that was how I realized it would probably be a good place to stop. So I went to see Mr. Claude Rust, who was the only real estate agent on South Royal Avenue, on the corner of South Royal and I think Prospect Street. And so there was a man in there with him who happened to be from Mount Jackson. He was Mr. Verenkamp, who was one of the implement dealers there in Mount Jackson. It was Triplett and Verenkamp. Triplett was a doctor, but he never practiced medicine. He got into real estate and forgot about medicine. And but he stopped and talked to my wife outside. She was sitting in my car. And but anyway, he said, if you want to, when I got outside, then Mr. Verenkamp said, well, if you want to practice, we need a doctor in Mount Jackson. Said, if you want to come over there, I said, we can help set you up and practice. I probably should have taken him up on that, maybe, I don't know. But I think I made the right choice in Front Royal because Mount Jackson has not changed at all in 50-some years. But anyway, we drove back over there again and looked around, and we figured, well, this is just a rural town. It's an agricultural town, my wife said, and she said the economy there would be pretty much the same. You wouldn't have the ups and downs like you would in industry. But anyway, we decided to settle in Front Royal. So then I tried to find an office, and the only office I could find was up over at the ABC store through Mr. Oxenham and Millar. Of course, Colonel Millar was the one that gave the grounds for them to build a hospital on. So he was a descendant of S. Rolfe Millar. S. Rolfe Millar and Pocahontas. The Indian maiden. So,
wasn't the Millar family also the family that owned the Avtex site? Weren't they also the family that owned the farm that later became the Avtex site?
Oh yeah. They owned the land that belonged to the Millar property. Colonel Millar. In fact, they built all those houses on 9th Street, 8th Street that you see there. So we rented an apartment on Kenrick Lane, right across from the plant, and in Cherrywood, which was not quite completed, but they were still having to paint the outside. And so we rented the apartment number 10, Cherrywood apartment, which was right in the middle section on the ground floor. And across the hall from us was a Mr. Hoover, who was he was the engineer architect that had when they built the powerhouse out that they later tore down for the Potomac Edison Power Company. But anyway, I began my practice, and I put an ad in the paper, and then I gave a paper boy some notices to deliver on his route, it's door to door. And I started getting patients, and because I found out very quickly that everybody was related to everybody else. So you had to be careful with what you said. Well, they say, well, who recommended that you come to me? Oh, my cousin, she came to you, and they'd name who the cousin was, and I figured, oh. So anyway.
What was the difference between Front Royal and Mount Jackson at that time?
Well, Front Royal was a growing community. We saw all the new construction of houses, and we figured, well, this community is growing, so that would be a good place to start, because that way that my practice would grow with the community. I'd be able to get more patients.
And how did you come to be working at the Avtex plant?
Well, we have to have malpractice insurance, and in December of 1977, the traveler's insurance with whom I was insured notified me that in February, when my policy would come due, that they weren't going to renew it. And I said, why? I haven't had any lawsuits, They said, well, they were getting out of the malpractice field, so which was a flimsy excuse. So then I had to try to find some more insurance. So at that point, I thought, well, gee, if I don't find any insurance carrier, what am I going to do? I have to lock up the office, So the plant's physician had died about a year before, Dr. Earl, and they still had not replaced him with anybody. They had filled in occasionally with some of the local doctors. So I was always interested in industrial medicine, and I have a very inquisitive mind anyway. So I went out to the plant and saw Mr. Ruff, who was the plant manager. I said, have you all located? I first called him, and I said, have you all located a doctor? And he said, no. And he said, well, why did I want to work out there? Since I had my own practice. I said, well, since industrial medicine had always appealed to me, that I would like to get involved in that too. So he said, oh, we needed a physician. He said, so to be plant physician who would oversee the employees, would do the physicals on prospective employees, and then the annual physicals on salaried people, and to keep track of all of their health. And so I applied, and I filled out an application and gave them some references. And so they hired me beginning February 1st of 1978. At that time, by that time, I had found insurance with an insurance company, the professional insurance company in Kansas City, Missouri, that interestingly enough had been started by a classmate of mine with another classmate, because they got tired of the way their insurance was handled when they had any litigation. So I then got insurance coverage with the professional mutual, so I was able to continue my own practice. If I had not obtained the insurance there, then I would have just had to work at the plant, and that would have been it. So anyway, the plant hired me to work from 8 to 12, Monday through Friday, and doing the physical. So then from 1 to 5, then I had changed my office hours, so I would see my own private practice from 1 to 5. The only drawback to was that if I had to hospitalize people, I didn't have the time I couldn't leave the plant at the drop of a hat to go to the hospital, although Dr. Cadden used to do that, but then it was under FMC at that time, so the situation was a little different. But anyway, I carried on the practice at the plant and then also my own private practice. And so it was interesting. I went down in the plant, and I had a tour of each department by Mr. Fodry, Durwood Fodry. He's no longer living, but he was one of the top officials. So every morning they scheduled for a week an appointment with a different department. So I would go in the department and see what they did there and what the risks were for people in their work. Because they wanted somebody who would be knowledgeable about the work. Because previously, the previous plant physician was not knowledgeable at all, and they had a lawsuit by one of the employees where he really did not incur any problem from the work that he was doing, but the plant still had to end up paying out some money to settle the suit. So I made it. They gave me a book that was half in French and half in English. It was on the hazards of CS2, carbon disulfide. So I read that from cover to cover and underlines different parts of it. And we used to do tests on it, and all the employees who were in any CS2 area.
What are the hazards of CS? What were the hazards that you were looking for? Well,
carbon disulfide. Well, if you got much carbon disulfide, you wouldn't be alive. The area where the cuttermen worked in the staple department, the CS2 level was so high that they could not get it within the limits of normal by the government, and so as a result, I used to go to the morning meetings, and so after hearing all these different things, I recommended that the cuttermen that worked there had to wear a respirator when they worked at the cutters, because the CS2 was too high a level for them to inhale. So they did that, and of course when they weren't working at the cutters, then you could walk away from there, and they wouldn't have to worry about inhaling any potentially hazardous levels, and so
were there other
anybody who had a neurological disease, for example, was not eligible to work in the Avtex plant because of the potential exposure to CS2. Now, they did hire women who worked in a department that was almost exclusively women's department, in the converting department. They collected the spools of yarn, and then they would have to climb up on a higher level to tie the end of the thread of the spool to the one spool to the next one, and then that way they could roll up these huge creels. I mean, they were a little bit longer than I can stretch, and they were about this big around, and then the yarn was wound up on that. So now, in the manufacture of rayon was a continuous process. So you had to work 24 hours a day or 7 days a week. The only time that it didn't was when you had a power failure, or if somebody goofed off, and then the plant would shut down. I mean, everything would cut off, and then they'd have to re-clean all the equipment and start over again.
Why did you have to do it 24 hours a day?
Well, because the filament was being made in a continuous, the rayon filament was a continuous process. They had these jets. They were platinum jets that had little holes in it, and they would, when they got ready to start up the department, for example, they would attach the jets in pairs. You had one pair that would, I can't show it with my hands, but one set would be here, and the other one would be on the other side. And then they would immerse that in the acid bath. So when they got ready to start making the rayon, then they would notify the viscose department, and they would turn on the viscose material that came through pipes, and then the viscose came out through these. See, these little jet heads had anywhere from 500 to 1,000 holes in them. I mean, you couldn't see them. It looked like you didn't have any holes, but they hold them up to the light, you could see the holes in them. Mm-hmm. And so when they lowered them into the acid bath, then as the rayon came out into the acid bath, it was precipitated as a rayon filament. So then they had to fish those out of the acid bath. You could put your hands in the acid bath. It wasn't that strong, but if you had cuts on it, then it would affect your skin. But otherwise, the bare skin, it was a weak acid. And then they would fish it out, and then they would wrap it around a wheel, and then they went down the aisle and wrapped it around where it would get wound up, and then it would be cut. It would be cut in strands of lengths of between maybe almost 3 inches, and then from that they made all the then they baled that, and then when they finally got it dried, then they would bale it up just like you see bales of cotton, and that's what was being shipped out to Procter and to the Johnson & Johnson. They made pads that they put under you in the hospital. When you lay in the hospital and you've got the green pad, well, that's filled with rayon. And then they also sent it to Procter & Gamble, where they put them in the disposable diapers. And but then they had in the one department where they made it into strands, and it was made a little different. The rayon was wound up in a container, like a cylindrical container, and it had a funnel-shaped device out of glass, and the rayon would go up and down in that funnel as the container was turning, and it would wind it up into a. You probably have seen these little bales of a string that they tie the when they're baling up hay on the field, and they tie those square rectangular bales with it. But anyway, as the rayon would be going up and down with that funnel going up and down, the rayon would get strung by centrifugal force against the wall of the container, and it would wind it up as it went up and down. So eventually you had a cake, they called it a cake, about that big around, and probably had about 8 or 9 inches long. And then when that would fill up, then they would stop. That'd be in what they call the box shop. Box spinning shop is where they made that. That was just down the hall and across from the manager's office. The staple department was directly across the hall. And to get those out, then they would take the cover off. They'd put their hand down in it and reach it in with their fingers, and they would lift that cake out. And then those cakes were taken to that department where the women worked, and they would tie those together to make the large spool that they shipped to North Carolina to the company that would then make the fabric with that rayon. So they had they also made carbonized rayon, which was used in the space vehicles. They were the only company that manufactured the carbonized rayon. They made the plates that line the space, the shuttle that we sent up now, and also they use the carbonized rayon to make the base of the vehicles when they re-enter space, so it doesn't burn up. See, rayon does not burn. It'll if you've ever tried to burn some clothes in rayon, all you see is a glow. But anyway, they manufactured a number of materials. I mean, it's surprisingly, they were the only company that because they had the patent on manufacturing carbonized rayon, and then they used that to make those tiles that lined the inside of the space vehicles, and also the nose cones of our missiles, and the space vehicles. So that's why after the plant first closed, when the government and the space agency found out that nobody else made the carbonized rayon to make those materials, they gave I think $50 million to restart the plant, and so they could manufacture a whole lot of that carbonized rayon until they could find another maker that would make that. Well, they couldn't make it unless Avtex gave them the patent that they had. So they were able to buy the patent from Mr. Gregory, who was John Gregg, rather, who was the owner. He was the owner of the Avtex company. He was previously an employee of the FMC, and he bought all of the FMC properties in Radford and Nitro, West Virginia, up in Chester, Pennsylvania, and Front Royal, with a leveraged buyout. In other words, through loans, even with the Equitable Life Insurance Company, they got some loans, and so he was able to buy it through the assets of the plant and of all the previous FMC plant. See, FMC originally bought Avtex as a loss proposition to be able to deduct it as a loss against their operations, and they ran it for 13 years, and then they decided to get rid of it. So they didn't put in very many improvements while they were there, while they owned it. But because you could see rusting pipes, and you wonder whether they were going to fall down on you. But they didn't. I mean, they replaced them by just building new ones and not trying to tear those out.
You mentioned that it was mostly women working in the
well, in that one department, that converting department, they were all women.
Do you know
and
why?
Mr. Shucks, what's his name? He used to be a coach in some of the sports. And he used to live on a Browntown Road on the house up on the left there, but I'll think of his name after a while anyway. He was the head of it. Then the men worked in the more dangerous areas, like in Visco's department. And now, if women had been sterilized, then they could work in those departments also. But if they were of childbearing age, then they would not allow them to work in the areas where there might be some hazard. Not that they had any problems in that, because during the 10 years that I was working there, we didn't have any problems with anybody.
What potential problems were there?
Okay?
What potential problems would there have been for, say, a woman who was of childbearing age?
They might show that possibly if they had a miscarriage, they might say, well, that came because she worked exposed to CS2. But they weren't allowed to go work in there, so you really didn't have any case to make. So we had tests that we ran, what we called, we tested. It was based on, all this rayon started in Europe, so all of the medical knowledge and tests came from there. And I can't put my hands on that book. I don't remember if I took it with me when I left, because the plant personnel director at that time gave it to me. He said, I want you to read this book from cover to cover and make yourself familiar with it, and so if you ever have to testify, you'll be able to do it. And but I don't remember what happened to it, whether I left it to the plant. I thought maybe the other doctor coming in might need it or what. But in any event, since I was, I had the inquisitiveness to check on everything. So I've been a person where if somebody came to me that was sick, I didn't just give them something for the symptoms. Well, I wanted to find out what they had. And if I couldn't find out right then and there, I would run tests, or I would send them somewhere to have some tests and then get the results back to find out what was causing their problems. A lot of doctors, I mean, I don't want to be critical of the medical profession, but a lot of them just treat symptomatically. You come in, you got a headache. Okay, they write you a prescription for a headache. Well, you take this. If you're not any better, come back in a week and try something else. And but I didn't believe in practicing that way. I wanted to find the cause of what they had, and that was why I developed the reputation of being the best diagnostician in Warren County. I mean I don't want to tell you this probably. I don't know if you want to put this in it. But when Dr. Riley, the obstetrician and gynecologist, brought in an associate one year, he invited the doctors and their wives to come over. He was having a cocktail, having a supper for them. And so I asked my wife if she wanted to go, since Dr. Riley had delivered my son, And she said, no, I'm not interested in going. She said, so I wasn't going to go. But when I went to lunch the day of the function, I was sitting in the cafeteria of the hospital, and Dr. Humphreys came up and sat down with me. And the first thing he asked me was, he said, did you get an invitation to go to Dr. Riley's cocktail dinner or whatever? I said, yeah. He said, are you going to go? I said, no. I said, my wife didn't want to go, so I'm not going. He said, well, I'm going to go. He said, I think you should go to these things. He said, if you want to go with me, he said, you can go with me when I go tonight. I said, okay, I'll go with you. So after he made his rounds, and we went over to Winchester, and so when we walked in where they were having it, Dr. Riley then introduced us to the new OBGYN physician, and then he said, if you want to go ahead, you can go there, you can get a cocktail, whatever you want, and to drink, and then there's the food, you can get a slice of beef, however way you want it. So I went on ahead, but then about that time, Dr. Humphreys saw Dr. Sager come in, and Sager was the orthopedist with the Winchester Surgical Clinic, and he had been sick, and he still looked jaundiced when I saw him. And anyway, he stayed back and talked with him. So all of a sudden I heard somebody say, "Good, that's a good place for that dumb SOB." But he used the actual words. I thought, God, who in the world is that talking like that with women around, So on the way home, Dr. Humphreys asked me, he said, "Did you hear what Dr. Murphy said?" Murphy was the pathologist. And I said, "I heard somebody use some cuss words." I said, "But I didn't know who it was." He said, "Yes." He said, "I told him that Dr. McCarty had quit practice and had gone to work at the Public Health Service." And his response to that was, "Good, that's a good place for the dumb SOB." And then he added that the only doctor in Front Wall that really knew what he was doing and was the best doctor there, says, was Dr. He was very highly complimentary of me, according to Dr. Humphreys. He said, "Oh, he was highly complimentary of you." But anyway, that's just a side story.
Now, what exactly were the tests that you would do? The tests that you would do, what were they?
Well, yeah, we had a urine test that we did on every employee. When every employee came in, regardless of where they worked, so we had a controlled group of people, like office personnel, myself as a physician, the nurse, all the women that worked in the converting department. They were a controlled group because they were not exposed to any CS2. So when you come in at the beginning of the week of your start of your shift, if you were on a 7 to 3:30 or 3:30 to 11 or 11 to 7, you had to go by the dispensary and give them a sample of urine. And then they ran a creatinine test on that. And that was based, that would show up whether there was any toxicity from CS2, see. Mr. Robert Biggs can enlighten you on that, because he was the head of, he was in charge of getting the environmental. He would go out and get samples of air in different parts of the plant grounds, and also of the river water that they used. So of course the plant had a water treatment plant just like the town has. That's why the town needs to buy that instead of letting it go to pot, because that'd be an additional source of making water that they could put into the town water system. I don't know if they're even considering that. But anyway, because see, the water that they used from the river to manufacture rayon had to be pure water. So they had to. So that's why they had their own water treatment plant. And also the plant can generate. I mean, I know they're going to tear down the old stack. I mean, not the stack, but all those 4 stacks you see that used to get the coal smoke when they burn coal to manufacture the electricity, to produce electricity, and they produce their own electricity that they use in the plant, see, the whole plant. And I said something to Walter Duncan one day since he was on town council. I said, you all ought to buy that so you could manufacture the electricity and use that to supplement the town's electricity from the power generating plants that they buy it from. He said, "Oh, we can buy it cheaper than we can do it by burning coal. That was his response, but that would be supplemental. I mean, if I owned it, I would say that. I mean, if I were running, that's what I'd say I'd do. It would be a supplement regardless. But see, then you get into people complaining because of the coal. But see, they manufactured that bag, what they call the bag house. While my wife was on the board of supervisors, they had to get a loan, $10 million, I think, to be able to do that. And so to guarantee their ability to pay for it, the county had to sort of co-sign, although they wouldn't be liable for the note. I mean, they still had to approve doing it. So they were able to build what they call the bag house, and that's where that lower chimney is that you see from Kerford Avenue. You can see that, and then they had a big rayon bag where periodically they would shake it down, and they would get all those fine particles of dust like sand that were in the particles that they removed from when the smoke from the coal burning. See, and so that's where all those piles of grit, you might call it, are there on the plant grounds, and they were talking about using that to fill some of those basins, you know. But anyway, they built the bag house, and then from then on, they didn't have as much smoke coming out of the chimneys where they burned the coal from the. So they had, I think they had 4 boilers there where they burned the coal and use that to generate the electricity. So anyway, those are a lot of the things that I remember.
What would happen if you did a urine test and it showed?
They would run
a high level.
We never had anybody that had a high level of creatinine based on that. I had a 4-inch thick loose leaf notebook in which I had all the results of the CS2 tests on all the people that were exposed to it. And so the state came up there and started questioning. See, by that time I had left. I mean, they retired me in '86, which I never thought they were going to retire me, because every doctor they had was already retired from practice that had taken the job as plant physician. Although Cadden wasn't, he was practicing in the afternoons doing cardiology and stuff in Front Royal. He had his first office there on Chester Street, where the library is there now. And then, but anyway, then later he had it in the building across from the hospital. The doctor's building there, he had it in there. Anyway, we would test those employees. Now, when they came back in after being on break, like say if they had worked 10 days and then they were on a 3-day break, then they came back in to start another shift, then we would test them again. We would test them when they started, and then the last day of their shift, they would have to go by the dispensary and leave a sample of urine. See, and some of the men employees got to be kind of smart alecks, and they would fill the container with water, ice water, from the fountain. So when the nurses looked at it, that looks just like water, you know. So one time, one sample, when Rita Edmonds was working there, I said, "That's water." I said, "That's not urine. It doesn't have enough. It should have some coloring to it." So I ran a chemical test on it, the pH and all that, and it was water. It wasn't urine. So anyway, but then somebody had taken the bottle and thrown it out under the steps as they went out of the building. And then they thought they were being funny, but actually it was for their own benefit. I mean, we were monitoring. So I told the guy that left the sample that looked like water, you know, I said, "Do you understand why we do these tests on you?" And he said, "Well, yeah." He said, "For the CS2." I said, "Yeah, but that's to show us whether or not you had a high level of, if you had any level of CS2 in your blood. If you did, then we would, what we would do, we would not let them work anymore for a week in the department that they were in. And we did the same thing with the lead burners. The lead burners were exposed to lead. See, we used to test for lead, give them annual physicals. However, I instituted a program. I told Biggs, I said we ought to do these twice a year rather than once a year. So then we did them every 6 months, and we picked up some other diseases. You know, we picked up people that had leukemia through the annual physicals. I'm trying to think of her name. She was a sister to Mrs. Woods. They worked in the lab. Of course, in the lab you had no exposure to any CS2. And we diagnosed leukemia on a number of people. I mean, actually, I would say we picked up 2 cases of leukemia, and then we gave the results then for them to take to their doctor, so that their doctor could then handle it. But that had nothing to do with the work of the plant. That was just an incidental disease that we diagnosed simply from the annual physical. And see, but you know, this is off the subject. I mean, off the track. I mean, I don't want to quote, but some doctors, when they get results of tests, they glance at them and put them aside, or else the people that work for them get the results and stick them in the file of the patient, and the doctor never reads them. And I know that for a fact because we had cases like that. And I had a patient come in one time to see me. He worked for the CIA, and he'd been sent to Florida to work there. And when he came back, he said everybody was smoking at that place, and he said he couldn't stand smoke. And now the whole time he was talking to me, he was going, and he'd say something else. He would keep coughing continuously while he was talking with me. I looked at his color. I thought, this guy has either got leukemia or he's got cancer of the lungs. So anyway, I checked his hemoglobin in the office. It had a hemoglobin of 8. Now, for a man to have a hemoglobin of 8, there's something radically wrong with him. Women run a hemoglobin maybe of 10 or 11, but he had 8. So I called one of the internists. Well, then he came back a couple of days later for me to get the results of the EKG and the chest X-ray that I sent him up to the hospital for, and the blood count. And the blood count came back. He had a high white cell count, over 25,000. Well, he'd been in a car wreck, then had minor injuries to his spine, and Dr. Smith had him as a patient since he was the orthopedist there then. And I thought, well, gee, I'll bet his white count was up when Smith had him in the hospital. So we pulled his chart out when I saw him in the hospital, looked at it there, and sure enough, there was the same high white count of over 25,000. I figured, yeah, they let this guy slip through. They should have picked up the leukemia a year ago, see, which they hadn't. But anyway, that's just a side story. Of course, if you break a bone, you get an increase in your white count, but then when he went home, they did another count on him. They should have checked that, but they didn't look at the results of that one, apparently.
Did you provide, like if there was an accident or someone became ill at work, did you provide medical care?
Oh, yeah. Well, no, we didn't. The things that we treated at the plant, Ruff told me, I said, I can save you money by not having patients to go to the emergency room. I said, I can repair sutures. Anybody has cuts or injuries, we can treat them there. Now, sometimes for burns, they would get severe burns to their legs. Well, one guy working in the staple department, he slipped and he got his foot. So they wore boots, short boots, and he slipped and his went down on where the weak acid, but it was hot. It was hot water acid that would flush the rayon as it was being cut by the cutters, and anyway, before he could get his foot out of there, that ran down in his boot, so he got scalded. But Mrs. Heisman can tell you that we had good results in treating those burns ourselves, which we did. And one time, one fellow had gotten burned, and we had treated it, dressed it, and then somehow he had gone to the Winchester emergency room with somebody else. He didn't go there as a patient, but whoever he took there. And when they saw his bandage on his leg, he said, "What happened to you?" "Well, I got burned at the plant." "No, you did? Well, you want me to see it?" So next thing you know, they unwrapped it. They called the plastic surgeon. He looked at it. So he scheduled him for plastic surgery. Now, he should not have done that, because I went to a seminar on burns in Richmond where the specialist from the MCV gave us a talk on it. So I specifically questioned him. I said, "How soon after you get a burn are you supposed to do a skin graft?" He said, "Not less than 10 days. He said, "You have to first see what heals over and what doesn't." And I said, "Well, that's what I thought." And this guy had gone ahead and done it. So I made the comment to him. I saw him in the hospital. I said, "Well," I said, "you got a little hungry," and I motioned my fingers through the dollar bills, I said, and he said, "Well," I said, "at least you got it healed over." I said, "Yeah." I said, "But now he's got 4 scars instead of 1, because they took grafts off of the front of his thighs to place on the leg." See?
That water must have been pretty hot if they were scalded.
Well, it was hot to scald him, but it would have healed. I had a little boy, Sheldon Rittenauer. He's still living. They call him Kippy. I think that's his first name. He was a baby. They were living in the Kendrick Lane apartments, and that water there was scalding hot. And his mother had given him a bath and dried him, and then left him standing there in the tub. Well, he was about 18 months old. And, a child is going to open the faucet. Well, he opened it, lo and behold, the hot water faucet came down on his foot. And so he had enough sense to back off. He went up to the upper part of the tub, but then he was still scalded. So she called me. She wanted me to make a house call. I said, what happened? He said he got scalded by the water. I said, "Well, I can't bring all those dressings and stuff up there." I said, "Bring him to the office." "I don't have a car. I said, "Well, call a cab." "But he's not dressed. Put a blanket around him. Bring him down like he is." So, I dressed his foot. He had a place about the size of a dime for a good while, but that healed over, and today you can look, there's no scar there from the burn. I mean, so anyhow, if you treat burns properly, you can heal them. I mean, they're second-degree burns. Third degree, when it really burns everything, then you have to do grafts then.
Were you there for any of the serious accidents that occurred later?
Was I what?
Were there any serious accidents at the plant?
Well, the accidents that happened were not due to the CS2. One man got killed. He was on the railroad crew, and they were backing in the railroad cars back to where they had to load these big reels into the railroad cars, and he wasn't thinking that there wasn't enough room between him and the building, and he was holding onto the car, and he got crushed. So he got killed. Then one other fellow, while I was there, had a guy by the name of Cogar, Cogar. I think his first name might have been Larry, but anyway, his widow was still around here. He was young. Anyway, they sent him up. They weren't getting any. They were starting up one of the machines, and they needed. So they had crystallizers in the plant too, and they recovered. So they had a zinc recovery process and the sulfuric acid recovery process. So that's where those basins, they had zinc and sulfuric acid in there. Of course, it's mixed in with water and all. So they would, and that's how Mr. Samborski got killed. and he shouldn't have been doing what he was doing. The crystallizers, of course, it was a steel tank, and then it had the coating. It had the inside coating is supposed to be rubber, but over a period of years, that stuff gets worn thin, And he had the habit of getting some of the polyester material and patching those holes so he could increase the pressure of the crystallizer, which he shouldn't have been doing. Not patching it with polyester. And then the mechanic should have been patching it with some other material. And what happened to him was I wasn't on duty at the time that he got killed, but because I think that happened after I left the plant. But the whole plant knew something happened when he got killed, because when that happened, then the rest of the rayon process couldn't go forward, so it would cut off the electricity, and then they'd have to restart the whole thing again. Because see, once you start manufacturing rayon, you got to keep going until you use up all the viscose that you're using. And,
what happened to the man?
Well, the guy that was crushed, he just got killed. I mean, the rescue squad came in and took him, but the one fellow one time had a crush injury to his foot. Let's see, what were they doing? They were drilling in the ground for something. I forget what that was. At one point, they recovered a lot of the copper from the stuff, buried stuff on the ground, see, and to get some money out of it. I mean, when they were having a little cash flow problem, they did that. And then they sold some surplus equipment. I bought a safe from them that they had, the surplus, when they got all the assets of the Radford plant. In fact, we went down to Radford. I went down there with Mr. Bob Guy. He was the personnel director then. I said, well, we can't use any of this stuff. I said, we got a better lab than they had. I mean, better, not lab, but better, what do you call it? You go up to the, to get first aid. What do you,
Clinic?
huh?
A clinic?
Yeah, not a clinic. I mean, it was at the plant where you came if you got cut or hurt on the job. You'd come to the dispensary. Dispensary. See, that they had tile there. The walls were tiled. I mean, it was a real nice dispensary. They even had a big safe. At one time, they used to pay people cash, so they had to keep the money down in that part of the plant. So they used that to keep the cash.
Let me ask one question. The man with the crystallizer, what happened to him?
Well, he apparently was patching the holes that were there. And as they increased the pressure in the crystallizer collapsed, and he was sucked in. Oh. Just completely. And then they wonder, well, where's Samborski? Well, so they called his house. His wife said he was at the plant, so he still came out working at the plant. I guess he came back for a second shift or something. And then they went looking for him, and then they finally saw some clothing protruding from the tank, from the crystallizers portion of the tank. And then they had to call a black girl. She was a hateful person, not because she was black, but she was just obnoxious. I don't remember her name, but anyway, fortunately, maybe they had to call her in to lower the level of the acid in the tank so they could get him out. See, he had a skull fracture, among other things, so he died very quickly. And then they dropped down in what was the acids, but he was already dead by the time he got down there. But they had to lower it enough so that the rescue people could get him out. See?
Was the acid in there hazardous? Or?
Huh?
The acid in the crystallizer, was it Was it weak or strong?
No, it was strong acid. I mean, the crystallizer would get the concentration down so they could reuse it to dilute down the acid when they used it in the acid bath for to produce the rayons. The other boy this Koger, it happened while I was there, but he was on the night shift. It was real cold weather that weekend, and he volunteered to work an extra shift. So he was working there. For some reason, they weren't getting any acid to be able to start the process. And instead of checking everything first, sometimes people are stupid. It's like sometimes the conveyor wouldn't be working in the plant to move the bales of rayon that they had moved. And I was there one time when they were doing that, and of course they had, under the union rules, the electrician has to turn the switch on and off. At the panel of switches. Well, the guy, the man that was working at the bale press, when they had the bale presses to bale up that material, he wasn't able to. They couldn't put the bales up on the conveyor. Well, so they asked the guy at the switchboard, you sure all the switches are on? This is in the morning when they start the new shift, see? No, everything's on. Well, the conveyor wasn't working. And so after 2 or 3 times he asked the guy that, and he looked at the panel box, and he thought they were all on, see? But he didn't look close enough, because when you've looked at a fuse box, I'm sure. And when that circuit breaker flips over, you can see it's a little out of line from the others, And so he had lifted one bale up and got it on so he could move it out of the way. And then he lifted another one. And those bales weigh 500 or 600 pounds. And so he ruptured himself. But anyway, but he hurt himself doing that. But so he got angry with it. He said, "You sure everything's on?" He said, Yeah. So he walked over to the switchboard himself, and there the thing was off. He flipped it on. He said, "What about that one?" He said, "How come that one wasn't on?" And then the electrician, So there he had to have 2 surgeries to fix that rupture. He had the first one, and then it wasn't good. Then he had to have a second time. Have an operation for a second time caused him to have a rupture and had to go through the process of 2 surgeries to correct it, simply because of the stupidity of the electrician. But this is what happened a lot of times, is stuff like that. Getting back to the creatine tests that we used to run on these people, that's how we monitored the people as to whether they'd gotten too much exposure. Now the rule was if we got a high reading on the creatinine test, then that person could not go back to his department, so he would have to be put into some other job where there was no exposure at all. Well, we never had anybody that had a high level of that. Now on the lead burners, we did have one fella that had a high level of lead, so we were testing them twice a year, every 6 months. So we took him out of the lead burner where they burned the lead. See, the lead burners, where they melt it, they put it in the big thing where it's all being dissolved. See, but then they had to weld sometimes in places. You'd get the fumes of burning, burn of whatever you were welding, and so we did an X-ray of them every 6 months, and then we did all the blood work on them. So and then we had a special test to test the level of lead that was acceptable, just like the levels of lead in the water, in your drinking water. You see, and you take old houses that have that where they soldered the pipes with with the solder had lead in it, including this house. Had the old pipes, old lead pipes. Well, you really had lead from that. And so if you went around town and checked how many old houses had the old lead pipes, you'd have to tear them down and get rid of the pipes and put in new pipes. Well, even the copper pipes, when I remodeled this house in '66, they were using the flux that they used, the lead, the coil that they used to solder the pipes with, had a higher lead content than what they use now, see? And so after the water sits in there a while, that's why you should never drink water out of the hot water faucet, because the hot water dissolves any lead particles that are there more, and so you'll get a higher concentration of lead in your water if you drink it out of the hot water faucet. And so he had a high level of lead. So we couldn't figure out why. So we put him in the shop to just work on valves. Well, there's no lead exposure there. So he was in there for a month. We rechecked him, still getting high levels. Couldn't figure out why. I said, well, damn, he's not even in it. After 3 months, he's still having high levels of lead. So anyway, we sent him to his doctor. So the internist then put him in, and I think he chelated him, but anyhow, but lo and behold, when they looked at the x-ray they had at the hospital, he had a dime-sized area right near the wall of his left chest. It was cancer. And when the radiologist looked at the film of the year before when they had taken it, there it was. But see, they had missed seeing it the first time because it was so small and close to the wall, to the ribs, they missed seeing it. And so they said, in hindsight, looking back, that we should have picked it up a year ago. But anyway, and it turned out that they did an operation on his kidney. He had a tumor on his kidney, so he had a nephroma, hypernephroma, and then he finally died. It was Jerry Shuffler. I guess his first name, I don't know if it's Jerry. He had a son named Jerry anyway. Clarence Shuffler. But the thing was that he lived in a house right next to Zuckerman's junkyard, and Zuckerman used to burn stuff in his yard. In fact, he told his wife when they used to eat in the summertime, he'd get the smell of that stuff. He said, man, that stuff smells just like when I burned lead at the plant. And so he was getting lead exposure there, see. But that didn't come from his working in the plant. The hypernephroma he got up was just that's why his kidneys were not functioning normally. That's why if they'd been functioning normally, he wouldn't have had an elevation of his lead level in the blood, see.
Okay.
And so anyway, that's the only case that I know of that had any abnormal thing that we were testing for.
You said something. You started to say something earlier that if you had been the doctor there when
they came, well, yeah, that plant never would have closed because I could have told them from memory a lot of stuff. When they started questioning about the people that were exposed, I would pull out my 4-inch loose leaf binder. Okay, here it is. I think I may even have that here in the house. I think when I left, I took that with me. Anyway, I opened it up, and it's okay. Who do you want to check? Joe Smith. All right, here's his results. And we used to send the copies of the results to Valley Forge. Once a week, we sent them a sheet with all the results.
I'm not sure I understand. You said there were questions about levels of exposure. I don't understand what you say when you say that. Who was questioning?
The state. The state came around and they started asking about CS2 and stuff like that. And when Dr. Sizer, that was the surgeon there, he didn't know anything about any of that. I asked Mrs. Heisman, I said, what did they do with all the books I had on top of my desk? the files that we had on people. He said, "Oh, they got rid of them." I said, "What did they?" He said, "They took them off and put them in the vault." So he didn't want to know anything about that. So they couldn't answer the state. See, they couldn't say, "Well, we don't have any problems," or "We do have. I mean, here we're checking them, and here's the tests on the people that are in the high CS2 area." See, the only place that was high CS2 was where the cuttermen worked, and see, where was the other one? Anyway, that's where they had to use a respirator while they were working at the cutters, when the cutters were working. If they weren't cutting any staple, then there'd be nothing. You walk down the aisle, the CS2 level would not be high enough to affect you, see? Because the ventilation that they had to bring in fresh air was not adequate to lower the level right at the cutters, because it was such a high level. It was that the cutter was just spinning around like that, cutting chop 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 chop, and cutting off that. And the rayon that they were cutting was made up of anywhere from 20 to 25,000 strands of yarn in that what looked like a rope. And would you believe it? One guy had just come out of the Marines. He was just a little fella, and he went between the. They were told that if they looked like that big strand of rayon strands was going to fall off the roller, because they had to go from one place to another until it got to the cutters. So they wrapped it around a wheel, and if it was sliding off, you used the flat of your hand. You didn't grab it. If you grabbed it, that thing would pull you toward the cutters, and that's what happened to this fella. He got pulled, and I went down and looked after the accident. He was small enough to where he got pulled between the rollers and the wall. If he hadn't been that small, he probably would have had a serious injury. But then this one night, another man had gotten hurt. I didn't see him when he got hurt, but I saw him later when he had plastic surgery down in Charlottesville, and then he was going to have to go back and have some more surgery. And they had 8 people that worked on that shift, in a couple of different aisles. And they're not supposed to all go to supper at the same time. But on that particular night, it ended up that only 2 guys were there working. So they had never had that rule. You had to have at least 4 people working. So in case of emergency, they could throw the switch that would turn the machinery off. See, and this guy somehow got his hand caught, and he hollered, and of course he wasn't supposed to grab it, but somehow he got caught in this. It twisted his hand, almost ripped his hand off. So when I came in that morning, Ms. Heichman said, "Well, they had to send one guy to the hospital." I said, "Yeah." So they sent him to Charlottesville. They had the helicopter come get him. And I looked at the emergency room report, said near amputation of the hand. Now he didn't have any near amputation of the hand. What it had done, it had just. I talked with Dr. Johns, who was the specialist on hands there at Charlottesville. He's the foremost specialist on hand surgery on the East Coast. And when I talked to him that morning, he said, "Well, I was expecting to see a hand dangling." He said, "But his hand was there." He said it got twisted around, and it just naturally damaged the tendons, and so he fixed them up fairly good. The only thing left was he was going to fuse the wrist. That way he wouldn't have he'd have a more functioning hand. See? And I saw him. He was going to retire anyway after that, but he came in for me to look at it for the last day, because he was supposed to go back down to see about having the hand fused. And so I saw how it looked, and I thought, how in the world can any doctor say that it was near amputation of the hand?
Were you the only doctor there? I mean, was there like a daytime doctor and a nighttime doctor, or just you?
I was there from 8 to 12.
And
Now, of course, they could call me to come in, if they needed me.
You've talked about Mrs. Heishman several times.
The nurses were very knowledgeable there to where they could treat most everything. But what they did, if they had any injuries, they would send them to the emergency room. And
were there nurses there around the clock? Were there nurses there around the clock?
Oh, yeah, 24 hours a day. They had a nurse on each shift. There was always a nurse there. They could take care of minor things, but if it was an injury, like a cut or a broken bone or something, then they would send them to the hospital. They wouldn't fool around with it. And the sad part of that, one of Doris Cooper's sons, he was working there, and some of these guys, and they're wise guys, he was working down in the viscose department, and where you have the well, on the floor above you was the where they used to steep sheets of paper that looked like blotter paper, and they were about that long, about that wide, and they would put that down in the tanks where they steeped it in caustic soda. You know what caustic soda is, like lye, and you don't want to get that on your skin. Well, this Beatty guy, he was a smart alecky character. He used to be up on that floor. Now, what they used to do, they would steep those sheets in that caustic soda so long. That's what they made the pulp. I mean, they chopped it all up, and then they used that, and then they mixed that with CS2 liquid, and then that would make a sort of a syrupy-looking liquid. Did you ever go out there on the tours? Well, no. If you looked at it where they had that, it was an interesting process, really. They had, and it would look at the viscose material that they used to make the rayon from looked like maple syrup, and it was the same consistency. But that was filtered through multiple filters, so it didn't have any impurities. If it had any impurities in there, then the rayon filament would break. See, it wouldn't be continuous. But he was working down in what they call pulling flighters. Well, when you pull flighters, you have the tanks that have this chopped up material of actually cellulose. It's pure cellulose is what they used to make had those sheets. So they were about as wide as this other one is long, and then the length of it would be almost the length of both of those together, because it would fit down in a tank. See, and then you'd stick several of them down in the tank, and then there's a plate, and then you put another batch of those in there. Then there's another plate, steel plate. So they would steep in there for maybe a half hour or more, whatever length of time it was necessary, depending on what kind of viscose they were going to make. So they had different qualities in it. So after they steeped so long in there, then they would take the press and run those plates together to squeeze the excess soda out. So that when they did that, then they would tilt that tank, and that would dump all those sheets of cellulose in what they call the flighter. It's a German word, P-F-L-E-I-D-E-R-E-R, the flighterer. And that's a chopping machine, and that would chop up those sheets where it looked like chopped up cotton. So then that would be a tank. Now the function of the person working down there pulling flighters, my son worked there one summer doing that. You would pull the tank off of you'd have it on a dolly, and you'd put it over to the scale, and you would weigh it. And it was 500 pounds or 600 pounds, and you'd mark that on the tank with chalk, 600 pounds, and then you would pull it back out. And then a man who operated a forklift truck, there was a fella, I guess he was an Oliver. Anyhow, he worked on that with the truck, and he would come there with a forklift truck and carry it up to the 4th floor, and then they would dump that tank through a hole in the floor down into the third floor where there were the tanks below there. See, and so when they dumped that in there, then it'd be then they would fill that, and then they'd go to another hole and fill another one, and so then those tanks then would later be filled. Well, first of all, they would then have a lid for them, which then locked and sealed to withstand high pressure, and they would evacuate all the air from the tank to where there'd be nothing but all that shredded cellulose. And then they had a line of carbon disulfide liquid, which would come from the plant next door, from the Allied chemical plant. They used to make it right there. But then they got to where they would just ship in the tank cars, and all they did was hold it there. And then the plant eventually bought the Allied property and ran it themselves. And they hauled in tank cars from Canada that made CS2. And so anyway, then that liquid, you could see through the view box. I mean, they had a glass, tempered glass, in the tank, so you could see it. And then as that liquid dropped into that tank was rotating, and it had a paddle in there. The paddle inside was rotating. The tank was stationary, and it would mix it. And one boy ended up with 3 fingers getting chopped off. And that long boy, he lived up there near just past the town limits there. There's a little village there to the left. Anyway, you're not supposed to raise the lid before it stops turning. And one guy from West Virginia, he was a new employee, he opened the lid before it had stopped. Well, then you would get a burn. I mean, so he got the side of his face burned. And he came up, he was cussing up a storm. I said, yeah. I said, you got in a hurry. You wanted to go to lunch, and you didn't want to wait till it stopped turning, and you opened the lid. No. I said, don't give me that bull. I said, the only way you get burned would be for that to happen like that. I said, when I was your age, I worked for $1.50 a day. I said, not $1.50 an hour, but $1.50 a day for 12 hours of work from 7 in the morning till 7 at night. He looked at me with his mouth open. But anyway, this boy this long boy, he wasn't paying attention. He had bought a new car, and somebody stole all 4 wheels off of his car in the Avtex parking lot across from the plant, near the apartments. But anyway, he put his finger in that hole that was there. The hole was there for venting, say, purposes, and that thing was still turning, and it whacked off the tip of his finger. And then the foreman then said, well, how in the world did you get your finger whacked off? He said, well, I put it in that hole. Then he showed him again the same hole, and it happened again. He whacked off another one. Oh, yeah. So he had the tips of either 2 or 3 fingers chopped off like that.
Had the role of the medical office at the plant changed over the years? The reason why I ask is some people have told me that people received a lot of their medical care through the plant.
Well, that was after I left. They set up what they call what do they call that when the company furnishes the medical care? and they get medicines and all. So they, that's why I thought they were stupid. Why they let me go? Because if I had been there, I could have taken care of all of that part. But see, what they did, they hired this one woman that was working in the emergency room to replace Sizer when he left. And then you had the plant doctor, like Sizer. He was supposed to take care of the adults, but he didn't know anything about children or women. So then they had to hire that other woman from the emergency room so they had two doctors they were paying then. And they were paying him six-figure money, and they were paying me peanuts, they get that. But that's what, it didn't make sense.
And he was providing medical care to the people who worked.
Yeah. So when they hired him to give medical care to they set up what do they call that? There's a word for it. Well, maybe I'll remember it after a while. But anyway.
Now, when did you leave the plant?
They retired me in March of '86. That's when Sizer replaced me. And I was surprised because I figured I would still been well, in fact, if they hadn't had a change in the personnel directors, I would have still been the plant physician even when they closed. But Jesse Moore was in charge. Then he applied for a job with a lumber company in North Carolina, but they misrepresented the job to him, and after he'd been there not even a month, I figured, hell, that's not what they told me he's going to have to do. So he came back and asked Eldon Campbell if he could have his job back, and Eldon Campbell was kind of hateful anyway. But the only reason he didn't want him back was because they couldn't manipulate him, see. Then they had Fitzhugh Wickham that was plant manager when I retired, and he was a yes man. I mean, if the manager told him to do this, he'd do it. I would not agree to doing it if I didn't think it was right. I would give him the reasons why. And at one point when I was working there, some of the officials from Valley Forge came down, and they wanted to build a new dispensary. But what it wasn't because of that. They said that the industries, the current treatment thinking at that time was that the management should be close to the manufacturing. So they were going to then move all the people up front that were in accounting and purchasing and all, to have them down in the plant. So they were going to put them in they were going to build a new dispensary to move us down what used to be the men's locker room. Well, down there we were near what was the remains of the old stack. See, the first chimney they built developed a crack in it, and they had to tear it down in the early 50s. And then all the houses on 14th and 15th Street, all the white houses turned black because when that big stack, the big stack used to disperse hydrogen sulfide and a little CS2 into the upper atmosphere. See, that was so high up, it's a couple of 100 feet high. And so when they were tearing the old one down while they were building the new one, well, when they got down to where the old one was about halfway the height of what it was, then the fumes came into town, see? And all the houses along 14th Street, 13th Street, they turned black. It was funny. And
did they have to paint
so the plant had to pay for repainting all those houses because they had to see people used white lead paint, see, to paint the houses white. Now they use titanium, see, but back then they used white lead. Now with the regulations on lead, exposure, they don't use it with lead anymore, so it's titanium they use. But that's what happened then. But anyway, the Sizer didn't have any answers. He didn't know beans about anything. And they started giving the medical care to all the people. And if instead of going to a local doctor, they could get their whatever ailed them, come into the plant dispensary. Bring your husband in. If he's not working at the plant, he can come in here and we'll treat him too, see? So that's what Sizer was responsible for, besides doing the physicals. Well, Sizer wasn't Malta. So I can't take care of women or children. So they had to hire that woman doctor. I forget her name. Anyways, so she worked there for a while, until it closed, I guess, anyway. And then after Sizer left, she continued on as the plant physician too. And but one time, one of the girls that used to work for me, June Redmond, let's see, she ended up marrying Dr. Side. Anyway, she was eating in the Chinese restaurant, and the personnel director from Valley Forge and a great big tall man that looked almost like John Gregg, but I mean it wasn't John Gregg. But anyhow, the two of them went in there to eat, and so she overheard them talking. She told me about it later. Apparently, the personnel director, I forget his name, but anyway, he had a pimple on his back like a boil. So he said he was telling the other man, he said, I went to the dispensary to see if I'd get the doctor to lance that boil, he said, and he wasn't there. And I asked the nurse where he was. He said, well, he had gone to Ohio for something. I said, here, we're paying this guy six-figure money. He said, we should have been a little more careful before we hired him. He said, we're paying him all that money and he's not even there. So when he gets back, I'm going to have to give him a directive that he cannot leave the plant and not be available without first notifying us to get permission to go. But anyhow, so it's all the money they were spending, when they didn't have, when they were running into problems with money. And then I started out working for them for $25,000, but I had all the full benefit. I don't know if you want to put that in there, but I had all the full benefits of a full-time employee, as if I were working 8 hours a day, see. So I had all those benefits toward retirement and everything else. And then it gradually went up, based on my work. And so I did get increases in pay, but not a whole lot, see. And but they knew I had the value. I saved them hundreds of thousands of dollars in expenses from the standpoint not only of the safety measures I instituted, but from the standpoint of screening out people. See, we got a directive about a year after I started working there that we needed to bite the bullet. That was what the letter said in the letter. It said we're going to have to just bite the bullet. It said we need to find out whether people use marijuana or other drugs. So while I'm listening to people's hearts, I'd spring the question, have you ever smoked marijuana? And so the heart changes the rate, see? And they'd say, no. I said, oh, come on, most everybody has. I said, I'm making a study on this. I said, most everybody has used it. Yeah, well, I did smoke some when I was in high school, So they would admit then that they smoked. But then, at that time, you could still check for marijuana and other drugs through the blood, have a blood sample, but that was $50, over $50 to do it. They couldn't afford to spend $50 on every prospective employee just for a screening test. But then they came out with a screening of that through the urine, and for $3 we could check for all kinds of drugs in the urine. So then they started doing that, and so they were testing everybody. Then we found even some of the people that were working that were on that, using it, and including that rich, his name Wagner, I guess. His father was assistant plant manager. I think it was Wagner. His mother was a nurse at the hospital. It was real funny. I don't know if you knew what she looked like, but I had a picture of a nurse going to give somebody a shot, in the middle of the night. And darn it, that character they had there dressed up as a nurse looked just like the Wagner's mother. I mean, like his wife, like Mr. Wagner's wife. And a couple of girls that were working at the hospital at the time, I forget who, there was one of them, was a very attractive girl. I don't remember her name, but they wanted, I showed it to them one day. I said, it looked like Miss Wagner. They burst out laughing. And they wanted to give that to Dr. Smith for his birthday. His birthday was in October, the same time mine is, see? And so I said, well, you can have it. I said, I don't need it. I was going to put it in the frame and keep it, My son salvaged it out of a recycling bin down in Blacksburg. He thought it looked good, so he kept it and brought it home. I said, oh, that's pretty neat. So anyway, they had it framed and gave it to Dr. Smith for his birthday. But anyhow, in checking him, we found that he was on it. Sometimes I would ask him, they finally made him, after Jesse Moore left, then he finally got moved up front. Well, Valley Forge didn't like that at all. They were against it. They said, no, he shouldn't be there. And but Eldon Campbell, who was the plant manager then, no, it was Wickham. And Wickham became plant manager, and but Campbell still was the head, and he knew he could manipulate them, and so they agreed that Wickham would oversee. So I forget what department Wickham was in at the time. Well, he would oversee what Wagner did, and so on that set up, they finally consented to letting him be the personnel director up front. Well, I would ask him to check on something, maybe somebody that, and then they said, well, I'll check on it and let you know tomorrow. Next day would come, nothing. And I'd be walking down the hall sometimes. Hey, Rich. He'd be walking like he was in a daze, He'd just walk like I'm looking at you. He'd just walk right past as if he didn't see me. I said, hey, Rich. And I shouted, and then, oh, yeah. And then he looked. I said, what'd you find out on so-and-so? What's that about? Then I'd have to repeat to him what it was for. Oh, okay, I'll check on it and get back to you. And then, so Miss Heisman knew that he was on drugs too, because same thing. She scheduled him to have his annual physical, and for one reason or other, he always put off going. Well, I can't make it, or he wouldn't show up. And one thing that Wickham insisted was he said, I know we're behind on the annual physicals of salaried employees. He said, I don't want to hear, in June or July that we haven't done them, or they haven't finished them, they haven't something we haven't done. So before I left, I said, when I quoted his words back to him, I said, remember you said that? He said, yeah. I said, well, we've got this one guy that he avoids having the physical. I said, I know why he's avoiding him. I said, because I know he's on drugs. He said, oh, you mean, he acted real dumb, like he didn't know what I was talking about. I said, you know what I'm talking about. I said, just the way he is, and when I talk to him. Well, I'll see to it that he has the physical. That guy left, and in fact, he went up to Pennsylvania to one of the plants up there, and he still hadn't had his physical. And that was 2 or 3 years after I had retired. So. But that's how we found out people. And then, so if they showed a positive test for marijuana use or any other drug use, amphetamines, we wouldn't hire them. And then.
What if they were already employees? Was there any kind of thing?
Well, they didn't want to fight the union. Right? They just we just keep an eye on them and watch them. But at one time, I think about 2 years after I started working there was rampant use of drugs. I mean, they were right there in the plant. They were buying and selling, doing stuff like that.
What kind of drugs?
Huh?
What kind of drugs?
Well, marijuana and whatever else they wanted to get, whatever they bought back then.
I don't want to hop around too much, but I want to make sure I understand. When you were talking about the closure, you said the state was asking about the CS2 level.
CS2 and other questions in connection with the hazardous areas and that, and they didn't get any answer. So then they brought their own people in and went to those areas and got samples and tested them.
You were talking about areas in the plant,
Yeah.
and workers not like the river or
Yeah.
any other areas outside of the plant.
And then that's why they shut them down, because they didn't give them the answers they needed to show that they were safe. So now there was those ponds used to contain zinc, sulfuric acid, and other chemicals, lead probably. And so it was profitable for them to recover the zinc rather than buy fresh zinc. I mean, to reuse it. So, and then it's, also paint. If you look at the label on your can of paint sometime and see all the things they list that are in that paint, and you'll see all these. So some of the sludge that was there, they could have sold it. In fact, I recommended to Al Ruff, because he gave me an assignment there one day on something. So I came back. I said, okay. I said we can sell some of the sludge to the paint manufacturers, because they need that to put in the paint ingredients that they were making. And that was before they were using titanium, but I mean in high use. But they could have used it. And but they had what they called mud cats. Well, the first time the guy came up, I said, "Mud cat." I said, "What's that?" He said, "Well, where they got those ponds." I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, they got a cable from one side to the other." I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, we recover the zinc and the sulfuric acid, and we have to move the hose through which they pull the sludge in to the crystallizers." Excuse me. He said, "Well, you have to move the boat, you have to move the pipe. So you have it here for a while here, and then you're in the boat, you go over there, and then you move it further down, and then when you get to the other side again, then you move it further over, I said, "Oh." So he was getting ready to go down to the mud cat, which is near the pond, and he'd slipped, and he hurt. He twisted his knee or something. Anyway, I forget his name, but he rides around with a car that has his name on it. He had a nice-looking wife, and damn, he divorced her and married somebody else. And Miss Heisman told us, I said, "Damn," I said, "this guy's crazy." And his wife was working at the plant. She in the converting department.
How did you feel when the plant closed?
Well, I felt sort of bad about it. And then when they tore down that big stack, I told the man that was here, I said, "What are you going to do with those bricks?" He said, "Oh, we're going to bury them." I said, "You could sell those bricks for $1 a piece, and you'd have more people asking for the bricks than you could sell." He said, "Oh, we can't do that." I said, "Yeah, they're real contaminated, aren't they?" Sarcastically, And there's no contamination on those bricks. Those bricks are heavy. You try to lift one up. I got one here in the front hall. I guess you'd lift it when I go out.
Were you still in private practice when the plant closed?
Well, see, I thought that I would increase my private practice again, have regular hours. But what happened? Let's see. Well, from '86, I still. I did increase the hours again. I went back to increasing the days that I was in. Because, see, when I worked at the plant, they wanted me to work on Thursday. And I told them, I said, "Well, Thursday I have office hours also." So then I then stopped the office and I went to work out there. They wanted me there full time all day Thursday. So I then had just Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. So then I went back into having more hours. But then there was a problem with my insurance, malpractice insurance. Like I said, the travelers, well then the company that I had, that Professional Mutual out of Kansas City, they went out of business because the state of Virginia wanted them to put in $10 million in Virginia in a fund, an escrow fund. I figured, well, we can't put that much money just sitting there waiting to see if we have to use malpractice on it, because they didn't have much malpractice, and they couldn't see the financial wisdom of doing that. So they said, no, we're not going to do that. So then the state said, well, you can't insure people in Virginia. So then I lost them. They no longer were insuring me. So, in fact, for about 6 months, I didn't have any insurance. My wife was really worried. She said, you really shouldn't be seeing people.
So the reason why I asked is I wanted to ask if you still had your practice when the closure occurred. From that, what impact did you see in the community from the plant closing?
Well, I knew it had an impact on it because the fact that so many of the people that I had as patients worked out there. So I knew that all of a sudden those people were out of work. They can't pay this, they can't pay that. And they did a lot of things for the community. I mean, they cussed about it, about the smell and all, but it's interesting about the smell because when I was in my office building on 6th Street, and there was a Sunoco station on the corner where the Exxon is now, and Hog Kearns used to run that. He lived next door to me there. But anyway, Winnie Kearns was his wife, and they divorced, and then she married Tommy Weimer. But anyway, he ran the Sunoco station, and so one day, a couple from North Carolina came in. They had this little boy. Said she couldn't understand him getting sick. He said he felt sick, and I said the only time he ever really felt sick was if he smelled something that smelled bad. I said, which way are you going? He said, well, we're headed back home to North Carolina. I said, well, get in the car and step on the gas. When you get about 10 miles away from Front Wall, you won't smell it anymore. I said, what he got sick from was the odor of the sulfide smell in town, see? She said, oh, is that all it is? I said, yeah, that's all it is. But anyway, that's a lot of interesting sidelights. But like I say, if I had been there to answer the state's questions, they never would have shut it down because if they'd seen these results on the people we were testing, so they thought there were a lot of people, because I think somebody wrote in and complained about something after the plant closed. Before it closed, and they had quit working, and anyway, what they said was not true, really. And so anyway, I could have given them answers to whatever they wanted to know because I had all the test results of the tests we were doing, the annual physicals list, the regulations on women, who could work and who couldn't. It gave them all the requirements of that. So that's why I felt bad that it closed, because Sizer couldn't tell him anything. He didn't know.
What about the concerns from things off the plant site?
The concerns of what?
What about, but you're just talking about issues on the plant site,
Yeah.
Am I right?
Yeah.
What about anything off the plant site? Do you think the closure just had to do with the employees? I'm not sure I understand.
Well, they closed. The state refused to give them renew the permit for them to discharge the treated water back into the river.
And that
what happened was they had an explosion. I wasn't there then, where the big electrical transformers. Well, of course, they were up on the 4th or 5th floor, and they exploded and broke. Well, then the PCB in the oil that was in the those transformers have oil in them, and you have polybichloride phenyl, polyphenyl bichloride, PBCs is what they call it, polybiphenyl chloride. Yeah, those are carcinogenic materials, and of course they came down from the 4th floor. Well, where would they go? Down on the ground, naturally. And of course, and eventually it got into the river.
So what you're saying is this
So
goes
that was
back
one reason.
to the issue of their permit being renewed.
Well, that's why they canceled the permit to do it. And when they first closed, of course, because of that. Then when the government and NASA found out that they were the only ones making carbonized rayon that they needed for the nose cones of our rockets, missiles, and then in the heat shield of the reentry vehicles as they come down. When you see them on television, you see that red glow. Well, that's the base of the space module. When the men were going up, and they're coming back down, well then that big thick base was made of carbonized rayon, see? And that provided that kept it from burning up. That took care of the heat of reentry into the friction of reentering the Earth's atmosphere, made all that heat. And so that took care of that. So they knew that would affect the nose cones we fire. They would burn up before the missiles. See, they go up into space and come back down, and then you wouldn't have a missile. It would be burned up. See.
What do you think about what's going on at the plant now?
What they're doing?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, they're dragging that thing out. Anytime the government gets in it, that should have been finished several years ago. See, now there's some asbestos in those front buildings, but you can remove asbestos. And I'm sure if you went in every house in front wall, you'd find asbestos. You'd find an asbestos heat mat they put there by the stove. And but anyway, that's some of these government regulations get really asinine as far as what we have to do and not do, because they carry it to the extreme. That's the unfortunate part of it.
Well, thank you for your help, Dr. Malta.
Yeah, well, I don't know if I've missed anything, but I started telling you about that Kroger fella.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, when they weren't getting any acid, and they checked everything. Everything is supposed to be on, and they couldn't understand why they weren't getting it. So they sent 3 people up to check different areas. So they got up to one floor, and then finally they split up. Well, okay, I'm going here, you're going there. So Kroger climbed up, and of course they had areas where they had where the pipes came through, like where they had cut-off valves and stuff. And you open up that door, and you look in, and Mr. Shure, B.A. Shure, you knew him.
Yeah.
And he lived up above the colored cemetery there in that house up. You get to his house, he had a driveway up through the cemetery, but but you could also go up in the back of his house by going up Gledman's Hill and go to the left where it dead ended. And my son used to deliver the paper there. He used to deliver it through the back door there. But anyway, I asked him the next day, and we went up and looked at the area where he fell from. And the way the plant was built, you couldn't fall more than one floor because you would land, because you had a wide enough area on the floor below where you. But he apparently had climbed up on the ladder, and it was a real bitter cold day. I mean, it was. I distinctly remember, and it was on a Sunday, and he apparently climbed up. Of course, we have to. Mr. Shure said, well, he just surmised what he did. He said he must have opened that hatch and then stuck his head in there to look and see if it was turned on or off. And he apparently got the strong smell of the sulfide, the sulfur, and that would have taken his wind, and knocked him back. And if he was just hanging there by one hand and jerked back, he would have then he fell down about 40 feet. So I saw him in the morgue. I went there up to the hospital to see what he looked like, and he was. But he got killed. He's a fractured skull and Lord knows what else. But and then it turned out that they had not turned the valve on to make the acid come in. Now that's another idiotic thing. A man loses his life to go check on it, and then it wasn't turned on. Then they found that the valve wasn't turned on. They turned the valve on somewhere else. But Mr. Shure surmised that he just got overcome by those strong smell of the sulfuric acid. I mean, you can't inhale that, And he jerked back and then fell. Of course, if he hadn't fallen beyond that one floor, we wouldn't have killed him. He would have had some injuries, but. Because I told him, I said, how in the world could he have gone way over there? He said, well, he's on the ladder in that distance and fallen, and he would have missed. Then I had the sad news of going to tell his wife. And she was nervous anyway. I mean, nervous as a cat. and when I gave her the news about Larry, well, we just went to pieces. She was. She was related to that Martin boy that works down at Gillam's. You've seen him with glasses on. Mm-hmm. And his wife drives a school bus. Mm-hmm. Let's see if there's anything else. After I'd been there about 2 or 3 months, Chuck Ledman used to be there pretty often. He was sitting in the outer part that they use for meetings with the safety man, with Ed Keenan. And I was about to go out in the hall, and he said, well, I've been getting good reports on you. I said, yeah. And he said, that's the first time they've ever seen the doctor down in the plant. I used to go down around the plant, just walked around, mm-hmm. and that made the workers feel like the plant's interested in us, mm-hmm. in our welfare. Of course, I wasn't doing it for that. I did it for my own information because I wanted to learn to see what they were doing. I mean, what their job was. If they worked as a cutterman, what they did. If they worked as a lacer, what they did. If they worked in spinning, what they did there. So one day, I noticed caverns under that property because the first year I was working at it, when I came in the next morning, I said the man that operated the fork truck parked his truck there for the end of the shift. When he came back in the next day, there was a big hole. And the forklift was there right close to where the hole was. It's a wonder it hadn't fallen in the hole. And so then they were hauling truckload after truckload of gravel and dirt, concrete, and they never did fill that hole. Mm. I mean, they put all that they could put in. Then another time, while Al Ruff was still manager, Bob Guy and I went down into the spinning area, and it had all these big steel cables going up to the beams overhead to hold up the machinery. And so I said, what do they got that for? I said, well, they don't know. So they had a big steel plate over one hole that had developed in one area there. And when they pushed it aside and shined the light, you couldn't even see bottom, flashlight, and I think, damn, I wouldn't want to fall in there. So I know there were caverns under the property, so I don't see how they filled all of them without that. But of course they tore down where the holes had been. It was down almost near where the big chimneys were. Of course you had acid water, weak acid and stuff like that over the years going through the sewers they had that went to the river, and of course that would eat through rock or limestone and all. So I'm sure there's limestone on this side of the river, that's like the Skyline Caverns and the other caverns. So all these hills and vales, you go down Happy Creek and see hills and vales like that, and there's caverns there.
Wow, that would be something. Well, thank you so much. This has been great.
Well, like I say, I was sad when they closed it down. And so Mike said, "What?" He said, "Why are you worried about that?" He said, "I didn't like it when you went out there to work. You ruined your reputation. You had a good reputation before you went out there." But like I say, I enjoyed the work. But I did save them a lot of money on the compensation cases. One guy had hurt himself in the river. It was in the summertime. He had on cut off blue jeans, and the first thing I noticed when he sat down was he had skinned his left knee. I saw a fresh scab over his knee there. And he said, I said, "What are you here for?" He said, "Well," he said, I hurt my shoulder and stuff." He said, "in lifting." His job was, now, when they would have a power failure, then they had a lot of that tow and stuff that was going to be made into rayon, into the stuff that they shipped off. And so they would rework it. So they would pile it in one room where they had a big empty room. And so his job was to lift some of that up, put it in a buggy, and then take it to where they would run it through the cutters. Well, if you have a job like that, you're not going to lift more than you can feel like you're lifting off of the floor, right? And so that's the first question. I figured, well, this guy is making this stuff up, that he hurt his shoulder like that. So anyhow, I let him tell his story, and then I said, "What?" I said, "How'd you skin your knee?" I said, "You got a fresh skin." "Oh, I was in the river, and the river was shallow, and so I had to pull the boat around over some of the rocks, And he said, "What?" And he said, "I slipped and I fell." He said, "But I didn't fall because I caught myself holding the boat." I figured, that's how you hurt your shoulder. You didn't hurt it in the plant lifting that tow. So he was concocted it. So then it went to a hearing. See, and then this O'Neill character, he's an ambulance chaser anyway. He used to go down to Union Hall and drink beer with the workers so he could drum up cases to bring suit against the plant to collect money for the worker. But anyway, the first thing he says was, "How much do you make in your own practice?" He said, "Do you make more? You make more in what you get the plant pays you?" I said, "Heck no." I said, "I make more money in my own practice than what the plant's paying me." And of course, the lawyer from the plant, he was objecting to it. See? But I figured, well, I wasn't quick enough that day. I should have said, "Well, he gets all of his money from the plant, so what's the point you're trying to make? He should have more loyalty to the plant than I would, since I only get part pay, But and then anyhow, he said something else, and I knocked that in the head too. But I don't know whatever happened on him, whether they whether he got the settlement or not. But one case they didn't get was a guy from the name of Jenkins, and he was no good. He worked on the labor gang, so they had a labor gang, and Mr. Nickens was the head of the labor gang. So he would tell them to, okay, go to the locker room and wait there to see what we have to do, and then I'll call you. So they would wait around in the locker room. So they had them to. They were down in the place where the coal trucks would come and dump the coal. But then there was one area where sometimes the coal would fall down in a pit there, and so they would climb down in and have to shovel it out. So he said he was down in there, and he went to